Dean Martin found the baby on his doorstep on a rain-soaked Thursday morning in February 1963. There was no note, no explanation. Just a 3-month-old infant wrapped in a pink blanket, sleeping peacefully despite the storm raging over Beverly Hills. Dean stood in his silk pajamas and robe, staring down at this tiny human being who had somehow appeared at his mansion like a scene from a movie. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. And this baby was real. And Dean Martin, the king of cool, had absolutely no idea what to do. The smart thing would have been to call the police immediately. Let them handle it. Let the proper authorities find the child's parents or place her in the system. That's what any reasonable celebrity would do. That's what his publicist would advise. That's what would protect his image and his career. Instead, Dean Martin picked up the baby. She opened her eyes when he lifted her. Bright blue eyes that seemed to look right through him. She didn't cry. She just studied his face with the serious expression of someone who had already seen too much of the world despite being only 3 months old. "Well, hello there, sweetheart," Dean said softly. "What are you doing out here all by yourself?" The baby reached out with one tiny hand and grabbed his finger. Her grip was surprisingly strong, as if she was holding on for dear life. That's when Dean Martin made a decision that would change his life forever. A decision that went against every piece of advice he'd ever received about maintaining his public image. A decision that would force him to become a different kind of performer, one who acted the role of a lifetime off stage. He brought the baby inside. Dean's housekeeper, Maria, nearly dropped her coffee cup when she saw him walking into the kitchen carrying an infant. "Mr. Martin," she gasped. "Whose baby is that?" "I found her on the front step," Dean said, sitting down at the kitchen table while still holding the child. "Someone left her there." Maria, a grandmother of 6, immediately took charge. She examined the baby, checked for injuries, estimated her age. "She's healthy," Maria announced. "Well fed. Someone's been taking care of her." "But why would they leave her here?" Dean asked. "Maybe," Maria said carefully. "They knew you would take care of her too." Dean looked down at the baby in his arms. She was still gripping his finger, still studying his face with those impossibly blue eyes. "What's your name, little one?" he whispered. Of course, she didn't answer. But somehow, sitting in that kitchen while the rain continued to fall outside, Dean knew her name was Grace. He couldn't explain why. He just knew. The logical next step was clear. Call the authorities. Report the abandoned child. Let the system handle everything. Dean reached for the phone twice that morning. Twice he started dialing. Twice he stopped. Because every time he looked at Grace, he remembered another little girl. A little girl from his childhood in Steubenville, Ohio. A little girl named Angela Crocetti, whose parents had been too poor to keep her, who'd been sent to live with relatives who didn't want her, who'd died of pneumonia at age 5 because no one had cared enough to get her proper medical attention. Angela had been Dean's cousin, and Dean had never forgiven himself for being too young, too powerless, too poor to help her. He wasn't powerless anymore. "Maria," Dean said quietly, "what if we didn't call the police right away?" Maria looked at him carefully. "Mr. Martin, you can't just keep a baby. What if the mother comes back? What if she's in trouble? What if she just needs time to get her life together? And what if she doesn't come back?" Dean was quiet for a long moment, still holding Grace. Then maybe she knew what she was doing when she left her here. For the next week, Dean Martin lived a double life. During the day, he went about his normal routine. Recording sessions, meetings with his agent, dinner with friends. He performed at the Sands, charmed audiences in Vegas, maintained his image as the effortlessly cool entertainer. But every night he came home to Grace. Maria helped, of course. She bought baby supplies, prepared bottles, taught Dean the basics of infant care, but Dean insisted on doing as much as possible himself. He changed diapers. He walked the floors at 3 a.m. when Grace couldn't sleep. He sang lullabies in a voice that had sold millions of records, but it never sounded more tender than when it was trying to comfort a crying baby. "You realize this can't last," Maria said one evening as Dean fed Grace her bottle. "Someone's going to find out." "Maybe," Dean said, "but until then, she needs someone to take care of her. And what if her parents come looking for her?" "Then I'll do what's best for Grace," Dean said simply, "whatever that turns out to be." But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that no one was coming for Grace. Dean hired a private investigator to look into the matter discreetly. The man found nothing. No missing persons reports, no inquiries about abandoned children. It was as if Grace had simply materialized out of nowhere, which presented Dean with an impossible choice. He could turn Grace over to the authorities now, explain that he'd been trying to find her parents himself. He might face some criticism for the delay, but his lawyers could handle it. Grace would go into the foster care system, hopefully find a good family, live a normal life away from the spotlight. Or he could do something that had never been done before in Hollywood, something that would require him to reinvent not just his public image, but his entire life. He could raise her himself. The obstacles were enormous. Dean Martin was a single man in an industry that demanded perfection. He traveled constantly, performed late into the night, lived a lifestyle that seemed incompatible with raising a child. He had his own children from his previous marriages, but they were older now, more independent. More than that, there were legal issues, adoption procedures, background checks, media scrutiny that would dissect every detail of how Grace had come into his life. But when Dean looked at Grace sleeping peacefully in the crib he'd had Maria buy, when he saw her smile for the first time, when she reached out for him whenever he entered the room, all the obstacles seemed manageable. The solution Dean devised was characteristically clever and completely unprecedented. He didn't adopt Grace officially. Instead, he hired the best lawyers money could buy to create a legal fiction that would protect both of them. Grace became his ward, a child he was caring for temporarily while her relatives sorted out a complex family situation. The paperwork was vague enough to avoid scrutiny, but legal enough to give Dean the right to make decisions about her care. Meanwhile, Dean began the most challenging performance of his career, convincing the world that he wasn't really raising a child, just helping out a family friend. The cover story was simple. Grace was the daughter of a distant relative who was going through a difficult divorce. Dean was helping out temporarily while things got sorted out. It would only be for a few months, maybe a year at most. The reality was that Dean was falling in love with being a father all over again. But this time was different. With his older children, he'd been young, ambitious, focused on building his career. He'd loved them, but he'd also been distracted, always thinking about the next show, the next recording, the next opportunity. With Grace, he was present in a way he'd never been before. He scheduled his performances around her nap times. He learned to function on 3 hours of sleep. He discovered that making a baby laugh was more satisfying than any standing ovation he'd ever received. "You're different," Frank Sinatra observed during a recording session 6 months after Grace had arrived. "Calmer, more centered." "Just getting older, Pally," Dean deflected. "Wiser in my old age." But Frank wasn't fooled. "It's more than that. You've got this look about you, like you found something you didn't know you were looking for." Dean smiled. "Maybe I did." The challenge of maintaining the fiction became more difficult as Grace grew older. When she started walking, Dean had to baby-proof his mansion. When she started talking, he had to worry about what she might say around visitors. When she started calling him Daddy, he had to quickly teach her to call him Uncle Dino whenever other people were around. The emotional toll was enormous. Dean was Grace's father in every way that mattered, but he could never acknowledge it publicly. He couldn't take her to industry events. He couldn't introduce her to his friends as his daughter. He couldn't even put family photos on his piano without risking exposure. Instead, Dean lived 2 completely separate lives. There was the public Dean Martin, the smooth entertainer, the member of the Rat Pack, the man who seemed to have no responsibilities beyond his next martini. And there was the private Dean Martin, the man who read bedtime stories every night, who knew every word to Sesame Street songs, who worried about ear infections and skinned knees, and whether Grace was happy. The most difficult moments came when Dean's career demanded that he travel. Grace couldn't come with him on tour, couldn't visit movie sets, couldn't be part of the glamorous world that defined Dean's professional life. So Dean began turning down opportunities. Not dramatically, he was too smart for that, but consistently. Fewer Vegas engagements, shorter recording sessions, no more extended trips to Europe or Australia. His agent was puzzled, his manager was concerned, but Dean's priorities had shifted in ways he couldn't explain to anyone. "Why are you passing up so much work?" his agent asked after Dean declined a lucrative offer to perform in London. "This isn't like you." "Maybe I'm getting tired of the road," Dean said. "Maybe I want to spend more time at home." "Since when do you care about spending time at home?" "Since Grace," Dean thought, but he couldn't say that. The years passed. Grace grew from an infant to a toddler to a little girl with Dean's eyes and an infectious laugh that could brighten his darkest moods. She learned to sing before she could speak in complete sentences, often humming along when Dean practiced at his piano. She had an instinctive sense of rhythm and an ear for melody that amazed Maria and delighted Dean. "She's got your gift," Maria observed one afternoon as 4-year-old Grace sang "That's Amore" while coloring in her coloring book. "She's got her own gifts," Dean corrected, though he was clearly proud. By the time Grace turned 5, the temporary arrangement had become permanent in every way except legally. Dean enrolled her in a private school under his name, hired tutors to help with her homework, attended parent-teacher conferences disguised as Uncle Dino, checking in on his relatives' progress. The teachers adored Grace, who was bright, well-behaved, and clearly loved. They had no reason to question the unusual family arrangement. Rich people, they assumed, had rich people problems that required creative solutions. But maintaining the fiction was becoming increasingly difficult. Grace was asking harder questions. Why couldn't she call Dean Daddy in front of other people? Why didn't she have a regular last name like her classmates? Why couldn't Dean come to her school performances? "It's complicated, sweetheart," Dean would tell her. "But you know I love you, right?" "I know, Uncle Dino," Grace would say, though Dean could see the confusion in her eyes. The breaking point came when Grace was 7 years old. Dean was performing at the Copa Room in Vegas when Grace came down with a severe fever. Maria called him between shows, clearly frightened. "Her temperature is 104 degrees, Maria reported. "I think we need to take her to the hospital." Dean felt his heart stop. "I'll be right there." "Mr. Martin, you have a second show tonight. 3,000 people are waiting." "Cancel it." "You can't cancel. This is Vegas. This is the Sands. This is my daughter," Dean said, and for the first time in 7 years he said it out loud to someone other than himself. Dean walked off the stage in the middle of "Ain't That a Kick in the Head?" left 3,000 confused fans in his wake, and flew back to Los Angeles on the next available flight. He spent 3 days in the Children's Hospital with Grace, holding her hand while doctors fought to bring down her fever. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He just sat by her bedside, singing softly whenever she was awake enough to listen. When the fever finally broke, Grace opened her eyes and smiled at him. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered, too tired to remember they were supposed to be in public. "Hi, baby girl," Dean whispered back, and he didn't care who heard him. That night, sitting in the hospital cafeteria while Grace slept peacefully upstairs, Dean made another life-changing decision. He couldn't live this double life anymore. Grace deserved better. She deserved a father who could claim her publicly, who could attend her school plays, who could put her picture on his piano without worrying about what people would think. The next morning, Dean called his lawyer. "I want to adopt Grace," he said. "Legally, officially. I want to be her father." "Dean," his lawyer said carefully, "that's going to raise a lot of questions. About how you came to have custody of her, about why you waited so long." "Then we'll answer the questions," Dean said. "All of them, honestly." The adoption process was complicated by Grace's unusual origins. Dean had to provide 7 years of documentation showing that he'd been caring for her, that no one had claimed her, that she had no other family. He had to undergo psychological evaluations, home inspections, interviews with social workers. The media, inevitably, found out about the proceedings. "Dean Martin adopts mystery child," screamed the headlines. "Singer's secret daughter revealed." Dean braced himself for the worst. For accusations that he'd hidden Grace to protect his image. For speculation about her parentage. For criticism about the unconventional arrangement. Instead, something unexpected happened. The public fell in love with the story. Here was Dean Martin, the consummate bachelor, the man who seemed to care about nothing except having a good time, quietly raising an abandoned child for 7 years. Here was the king of cool, showing a depth of character that no one had suspected. The interviews Dean gave were unlike anything he'd done before. Gone was the casual deflection, the self-deprecating humor, the emotional distance. When he talked about Grace, Dean was genuine, vulnerable, completely without pretense. "She came into my life when I didn't know I needed her," he told one reporter, "and she taught me what it means to love someone more than yourself." "Why didn't you go public earlier?" another journalist asked. "Because it wasn't about me," Dean said simply. "It was about what was best for her, and I thought keeping things quiet was best. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was just scared." Scared of what? Dean was quiet for a long moment. "Scared that someone would take her away from me. Scared that I wasn't good enough to be her father. Scared that the world would see through all this cool guy stuff and realize I'm just a man from Ohio who got lucky." The adoption was finalized on a Tuesday morning in September 1970. Grace Patricia Martin officially became Dean's daughter, with all the legal protections that entailed. That evening, Dean performed at the Sands as scheduled. But for the first time in 7 years, Grace was in the audience. "I want to dedicate tonight's show to someone very special," Dean said into the microphone. "My daughter Grace, who's here with me tonight for the first time." The spotlight found Grace in the front row, beaming with pride as the audience gave her a standing ovation. "She taught me that the coolest thing you can be is a father," Dean continued, "and the most important performance is the one you give at home." He sang, "Everybody loves somebody," looking directly at Grace, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Years later, when Grace was grown and pursuing her own career in music, she would often be asked about what it was like to be Dean Martin's daughter. "People expect me to talk about the glamour, the fame, the Hollywood lifestyle," she would say, "but my father wasn't the Dean Martin everyone thinks they know. My father was the man who sat up all night when I had a fever, who helped me with my homework, who taught me that family isn't about blood or legal documents or even how you start out together." "Then what is it about?" reporters would ask. "It's about who shows up," Grace would say. "It's about who stays. It's about who chooses to love you every single day, even when it's complicated, even when it's difficult, even when the whole world is watching." Dean Martin never found out who left Grace on his doorstep that rainy February morning. He never learned why someone had chosen him to care for this extraordinary child. But he came to believe it was the most important role he'd ever been cast in. Not Dean Martin the entertainer, not Dean Martin the singer, not Dean Martin the king of cool. Dean Martin the father. The man who found his greatest performance in the small, daily acts of love that no audience would ever see. The man who discovered that the most beautiful music is a child's laughter echoing through your house at the end of a long day. And sometimes the most important things that happen to us are the ones that start with no explanation, no warning, no script. Sometimes they just appear on your doorstep on a rainy morning and they change everything. Forever.